I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. The Times conducted an extraordinary year-long investigation into the taxi industry. It revealed that industry lenders artificially drove medallion prices to $1 million. Then they trapped drivers into huge loans they couldn't afford. Many were financially devastated. Some even committed suicide. All the while, New York City officials did nothing. You'll meet Brian Rosenthal, the reporter behind the probe. But we begin with the question dominating Washington: will House Democrats launch an impeachment inquiry? President Trump again threw gasoline on that fire with a wild and controversial interview with ABC News. In it, he said he was open to getting dirt on political opponents from foreign governments. The New Yorker called that going from no collusion to pro-collusion.
You want that kind of interference in our elections?
It's not an interference. They have information. I think I'd take it. If I thought there was something wrong, I'd go maybe to the FBI if I thought there was something wrong.
Trump also basically accused former White House counsel Don McGahn of committing perjury. McGahn testified under oath that the president ordered him to fire Robert Mueller. Trump says it never happened.
I never suggested firing Mueller.
That's not what he says.
Excuse, I don't care what he says. It doesn't matter. That was to show everyone what a good counsel he was.
But why would Don
But we
McGahn
had a
lie?
business.
Why would he lie under oath? Why would he lie
Because he
under oath
wanted to
Robert
make
Mueller?
himself look like a good lawyer.
Obviously, a mind-boggling TV interview is not an impeachable offense. But in addition to the obstruction allegations spelled out in the Mueller report, the Trump administration has defied congressional subpoenas for witnesses, documents, and has claimed almost blanket executive privilege over everybody and everything. The Democrats haven't gone to court to enforce the subpoenas. No testimony yet from Robert Mueller, closed-door testimony from Don Jr. and Hope Hicks. House Speaker Pelosi clearly thinks impeachment could be a plus for Trump. So, are the Democrats being politically savvy or politically wimpy? Mara Gay, a member of the New York Times editorial board, Eleanor Randolph, a contributing writer for the Times, and John Mollenkopf, a distinguished professor of political science at the CUNY Graduate Center. I was struck this week that Speaker Pelosi removed from the table the possibility of censure as one of the alternatives. So it seems that we are faced with doing nothing or moving ahead toward impeachment. Censure seemed to be sort of a middle ground. Where does that leave us now?
You know, we've got to remember that the election is a year from this coming November. And so what I think the Democrats are trying to do is figure out how long you can have this investigation. And I think they'll get to impeachment eventually. I mean, I think, first of all, you listen to Trump. Who believes anything he says? First of all, he's not sworn to tell the truth to ABC News, but also, I mean, he's trying to bait the Democrats, and, I think they're going to come around very slowly and very cautiously to some kind of impeachment proceeding.
Bait
not
them
censure.
into going ahead with impeachment?
Yeah.
Why?
Because he should be impeached, frankly.
But why does he want to be impeached?
Well, I think...
What's in it for him?
Oh, I think he's just playing games, which he does all the time. And
he likes to think of himself as a victim.
Oh, that's right. And also he saw what happened to Clinton, who got impeached. And
it was the best thing that ever happened
and
to him.
said it was the best thing that ever happened to him. Sort of.
John?
Right.
Well, there's an interesting asymmetry in this period when so many Democrats are running against each other and focusing on each other and only somewhat on Trump. And Trump has a kind of open field to just dump on the Democrats. So a political logic for doing impeachment would be, this would be a process that wouldn't be attached to a particular Democratic presidential candidate, that would keep the spotlight on all the horrible things that, if the special prosecutor thought he could indict he would have indicted the president. There's plenty of evidence in the Mueller report for impeachment, it seems to me.
Mara, what do you think?
I tend to agree. I also think that, you know, the Democrats do need to start shifting pretty quickly from now from lobbing insults at one another, as you said, John, and trying to turn that spotlight onto the malfeasance and the behavior of the Trump administration, not just the president himself, whether that's through impeachment hearings, but also having public hearings about the Department of Homeland Security and why we've been keeping children in cages, about the Environmental Protection Agency. There's a lot of very disturbing policy changes that have been taking place, and corruption, or at least the appearance of corruption, throughout the Trump administration. And the Democrats really, not just because it's politically expedient, but also because I think it's the right thing to do, they need to have those hearings be as public as possible, because that's really how you bring it to the American people. It's very different than having Hope Hicks testifying behind closed doors.
Next week, the Democrats are going to debate. There are going to be two of them. How are they going to possibly distinguish themselves from one another?
That's a great question.
I'm sure they're all asking themselves that
That's
very,
right.
very intently.
I mean, they're going to either have to do something outrageous or say something very important or profound or what?
It's going to be a circus.
Yeah, it has to be the perfect Twitter, you know,
Right.
what is it, 240 calories now.
Calories,
yeah.
we tend to think of even
Character.
more.
Yeah, but I mean, you're going to have this bumper sticker, you know, somebody's going to have to do that, you know?
There's going to be 10 of them, I believe, on stage at once, and then the next night, 10 more. It's also it's wild for me to see folks like Elizabeth Warren, who have been really surging on the same stage as people like Mayor Bill de Blasio. I'm not quite sure how that's going to work. I think the lower on the totem pole you are, the more desperate you're going to be to have some kind of viral moment.
And someone is probably going to be, one of the questioners undoubtedly going to try to put their feet to the fire and talk about impeachment. Are they going to look wimpy, or are they going to look more aggressive?
I think they'll mostly have pretty aggressive responses because
Trump,
they have
yeah.
to stand up to Trump.
Yeah.
And I think each of them will look for something that's a little bit special about themselves that perhaps people haven't commented on all that much, and roll that out as, here's a reason to like me you might not know about, or here's something special about me that you should take into account. And it won't be too much more than that, although I think there will be a tendency to try to knock down the top people, especially Joe Biden.
Well, he's in the second night, you know, he's going to be there, and that's right, they're going to come after Biden.
Eleanor, as a Southerner, I can ask you this. Him defending two senators, or not defending them, in effect praising them because of their civility, they happen to be segregationists, how awful a thing is that?
Well, you know,
or should it have been tempered
I
by the
think
fact that, you know,
he is so good. The foot and mouth disease with Biden. It's been true every campaign he's ever had. I think what he was trying to say is, if those states elect these people, you have to deal with them in the Senate. And that's one of the things that's missing now. I mean, people, he didn't agree with Eastland, he didn't agree with segregation, but he had to deal with them on all the budget, all the, you know, everything.
he had to win their votes.
He needed their votes, and they were ostensibly Democrats back then, of course. It doesn't. I find it really odd that people think he's a racist because he had to deal with them.
Well, is that something he should apologize for?
He's not going
So
to.
I think what Eleanor's right, first of all, that's a big part of this, but what a lot of people took exception to wasn't just that he was explaining how he was able to work with them, but that he seemed to be talking about that era as this golden age of the kind of nostalgia that he has about this. And I just think it's an important thing to remember that part of the reason that Congress was able to have working relationships in that way, not just between Republicans and Democrats, but really notably between Southerners and Northerners, is because they had put aside the question
Nobody stood
of
up.
civil rights. And so they
Absolutely.
essentially said, don't worry, we won't give rights to Black Americans in full citizenship. And so therefore we'll be able to work together. And I think what people took exception to was hearing Joe Biden wistfully talk about that era. Whether he was aware, I don't think that's how he personally remembered it. But I think for a lot of other Americans, that's what they were thinking of. And, the thing is, people make mistakes, people can change. That was a long time ago. I think the issue that Biden's going to have is people in the Democratic Party want to hear him say, that was then, I've changed. And they haven't heard that. And I think, when he went even farther, Biden did, and then called on Cory Booker to apologize to him, that was really a tone-deaf moment.
The president accused the Times this week of treason. Has he done anything since the Mueller report that would pile on, add to the evidence for impeachment?
Well, you do have the publisher of the Times writing in the Wall Street Journal today. This is Thursday. And it's just unforgivable that he would do this. Not only here in this country, I think the rule of law would protect most journalists, but if you look out in the rest of the world, it's his effort to make the press the enemy of the people is used everywhere, against reporters who are trying to tell the truth.
And it seems to be working as a political tool, at least in this country.
Well, it always works to go after the press. That's
especially the national cosmopolitan press read by, the Eastern and the West Coast elites and so forth is part of his whole weird kind of class politics that he tries to play. But both parties have become much more uniform. We don't have conservative Southern Democrats, and we don't have Northern liberal Republicans anymore. So the kind of comedy that you could use cross-cutting cleavages to create odd alliances is just not something that you can do these days. And I think the interesting maybe tension within the Democratic Party at this point is how much should we have a sort of workerist raise up the middle class, protect, improve the life of white working class versus claims for all the different groups that are not sort of non-college educated whites within the party, whether they're elites or minorities, and squaring that circle is not going to be so easy. I think Clinton did it pretty effectively in his first race.
Well, we'll see what they say next week. Thanks to Mara Gay and Eleanor Randolph of the New York Times, John Mollenkopf of CUNY. And up next, a disturbing look at the taxi industry. The Times took a deep dive into how predatory lenders destroyed the lives of thousands of immigrant taxi drivers. You'll meet the reporter in a minute.
The people running the taxi industry sold the idea that the medallion was a bulletproof financial asset on which drivers could build their future. We want to believe that in America, if you work hard, you'll succeed.
Thank you, sir. Have a good day.
But if the government fails in its responsibilities to the people, the American dream can become just that, a dream.
That was a clip from an episode of The Weekly, a New York Times TV show on FX and Hulu. It was based on a year-long investigation. It found how unscrupulous lenders ruined the lives of thousands of taxi drivers. It did it by inflating the price of medallions, trapping those drivers into loans they couldn't afford. Who's to blame for devastating their lives, the lives of immigrant drivers, turning their America dream into a nightmare? The answer, of course, is complicated.
It's convenient to blame ride-hail apps like Uber and Lyft. But we found that's only a small part of the story. The real reason for this crisis? A financial bubble. allowed to balloon over a decade, not just by bankers and investors, but by the city itself.
Brian Rosenthal is an investigative reporter on the Metro desk of the New York Times. He already has written 2 parts of those series, which you probably have read in the Times and online at nytimes.com. Brian, it is a complicated issue, and people have so many misconceptions about what taxis are all about. You're sitting in a cab and in traffic, and you see the meter ticking off and think the driver's making money. You go in and the fare is up and think the driver's making money. What went wrong with this system?
I think the fundamental thing that changed about the taxi industry and what led to all of these negative impacts that we're seeing is that it used to be that the business model was more simple. There were taxis on the road, they would bring in money through fares, and the money would either go to the driver, if the driver owned the cab, or if he was working for a fleet, it would be split between the fleet owner and the driver. And that was kind of the old system. And what happened starting in the early 2000s is that taxi industry leaders, those fleet owners, as well as some brokers and bankers, decided that there was actually a way to make even more money than that. And that was to view the medallion, the permit that allows you to be on the road, as a financial asset that can be used to lend against, to collateralize, to inflate, and to turn a bigger profit from.
And what was the city doing all this time? Did it say that's an okay thing to do?
Well, the city was really focused on selling medallions. They decided in the early 2000s to sell about 1,000 new medallions. There had historically been about 12,000 medallions corresponding to 12,000 cabs on the road. The city said, let's sell 1,000 more. The idea was the city's growing bigger, it needs more cabs. But the idea was also the city has a big budget gap, and this is going to make some money. And the city was really focused in those years on selling medallions and getting the highest price possible. And so we found that they actually, not only did they not control some of these exploitative loans and practices that were happening, they actually contributed to the inflation of the medallion price and to some of these bad practices.
Well, what drove the price down? What put the drivers in trouble with their loans? How much of that was Uber and Lyft coming in and, in effect, vastly increasing the pool of cars available?
So Uber and Lyft had an impact, no doubt about it. But what we found is that the impact has actually been smaller than you might think, in part because yellow taxis are so focused on Manhattan. On Midtown Manhattan, 97% of taxi rides are either in Midtown Manhattan or the airports. And those areas have been somewhat less affected by Uber and Lyft. So we found that Uber and Lyft have had about a 10% impact on the revenue of how much a cab can bring in. Medallion prices have gone down by about 90%. So obviously there's a disconnect there. And what we've found is that this was quite simply a bubble, and that bubbles happen in our economy from time to time, and they are inflated and then they burst. And this was a bubble bursting, and it was something that was bound to happen because of the economics.
The city has now come up with $10 million, it says, as you reported in the Times. Is that going to solve the problem?
No, it's not. If you do the basic math, there are, as I said, 13,000 medallions in the city. You figure about half of them are actually owned by the driver. So 6,000 owner drivers, and they owe, most of them, about $500,000 on their loan. So, and that they're
each
each, yes, and they're underwater by almost all of that in many cases, because the medallion is really not worth much. And so, just to do the math, 6,000 drivers times $500,000, that's $3 billion right there. So 10 million is obviously a drop in the bucket.
So how do you dig them out of this? Or is this the free market at work and you just say that's the way it goes?
Well, these are the conversations that are being had right now. The question of whether this is just the free market is an interesting one, because these loans were actually classified as business loans, because they were loans that enabled people to operate a business, in this case a taxi. But what's unusual is, first of all, it's a business of one person, right? And second of all, each of these loans required a personal guarantee that in which the borough had to pledge all their personal assets anyway. So it was really, in many ways, a consumer loan that was classified as a business loan. And business loans have much fewer regulations, and it's much harder to do anything about those loans because our society kind of deems those as situations where the borough is sophisticated and can handle himself or herself.
Who is looking the other way here?
Well, the City Taxi and Limousine Commission is responsible for regulating the taxi industry. It licenses the brokers, which were a huge part of the story here. But there were also a bunch of other regulatory agencies that were involved, and you really are talking about lending regulators on several different levels. Of course, on the state level, we got the State Department of Financial Services. On the federal level, we have the FDIC, the SEC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and there's also an agency called the National Credit Union Administration, which oversees the credit unions, and a lot of these lenders were credit unions.
Brian, who made money off this?
A lot of people. I mean, the city made $855 million off of medallions.
It's a lot of money.
It is. But more to, I think, what your point is getting at, the lenders made a tremendous amount of money. The brokers made a tremendous amount of money. And the fleet owners, in many cases, made a lot of money. We were able to see the finances of some of these people. And we saw, for example, a lender, the former CEO of Progressive Credit Union, which is a credit union, small credit union, had only about 25 employees, focused exclusively on taxi medallions. This man made $30 million during this period. There were people that were doing very well.
So what should be done now? 10 million, not enough, as you say. How do you bail these people out? Is this like the mortgage crisis?
Yeah, I mean, that's the conversation that's happening now, and it's unclear. I mean, the city is not going to spend $3 billion. Is there a compromise that could be worked out? Potentially, but that's what's being discussed.
And who comes up with the money?
I mean, I guess taxpayers, but also what's being discussed is some sort of a compromise solution where the government puts up some money in the form of some type of bailout. The lenders write down some of these loans, take a hit on some of these loans, forgive some of the debt. And the borrowers also keep really high loans. And so everybody kind of takes a hit, but everybody gives in, and the situation could be right-sized a little bit. That's what's being discussed.
The Times has so far run 2 of your stories. This is an ongoing series. What impact have those 2 stories had so far?
Well, it's led to this discussion that we're having now about a potential bailout. But there are also a bunch of other impacts. The City Council is holding a hearing on Monday, June 24th, to talk about changing the regulations to make sure this never happens again, and also looking at the city's role in this. The Attorney General has opened an inquiry of the lenders and the lending practices, and the mayor is actually doing an investigation of the brokers specifically and the part that they played. So there's still a lot of time, and who knows how this will turn out, but some investigations have begun.
You can read a lot more in the Times at nytimes.com. You could also wonder where everyone was before Brian Rosenthal wrote these stories. I'll add my thoughts on CODA coming up next. Exactly a century ago, 3 Brooklyn men refused to pay an extra 5-cent subway fare to get to Coney Island. They jumped over the turnstile instead. A city magistrate declined to rule on the legality of the 10-cent fare, but he did refuse to charge the trio with disorderly conduct. Ever since, and probably beginning even earlier, the legal issue of fare evasion has bedeviled mass transit in New York. You can argue that the subways and buses should be free, but they're not. So evasion costs the system money it's due. That means less to spend on improving service for everybody. Fare beaters who wantonly break the law don't make great civic role models for New York kids. They contribute to a climate of chaos, of a municipal government and an urban society out of control, the way graffiti once did. And they leave law-abiding passengers rightfully resentful. What kind of suckers are we paying the full freight? Governor Cuomo and Mayor de Blasio said this week they want to deter fare beaters, not arrest them. How? Deploy 500 cops to issue summonses. Problem is, more people probably ignore summonses than subway fares. And most don't care if outstanding summonses prevent them from getting driver's licenses. Why? Because they don't own cars. More video cameras will be installed at stations. How that will deter turnstile jumping is unclear also. The governor estimates that fare beaters cost the system $240 million annually. But the fact is, nobody knows for sure. Which means that while their plan may be worth trying, he and the mayor will be able to claim success with scant evidence, let's call it a token, of proof. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I am Sam Roberts.